My hands were already damp before I realized why, the napkin slipping slightly as I folded it along the edge of my plate. The room was warm, crowded with familiar voices, and the smell of food lingered heavily in the air. Someone had just finished telling a story, and I could feel the moment before the response arrived, that brief suspension where everyone waits to see how the room will react. The laughter came quickly, layered and effortless, moving across the table without slowing. It was light, unguarded, and shared easily among them. I stayed still, my smile forming out of habit, even as something tight settled behind my ribs. That was when I understood, not with shock but with clarity, that I had been standing in a role they found amusing, not temporary. I am Marissa, and I have always known how to make myself unobtrusive in a room like this. I learned early how to read the rhythm of conversations and how to step back when the pace no longer made space for me. Silence was never forced on me, but it became familiar because it kept everything smooth. This gathering followed the same pattern as so many before it. Plates had been passed carefully, chairs adjusted, glasses refilled without asking. I had arrived on time, offered help before being asked, and taken the seat that no one seemed to claim. These small choices were automatic now, shaped by years of knowing where I fit. My parents sat across from each other, their conversation moving easily from topic to topic. My older brother leaned back in his chair, relaxed and confident, adding comments that drew immediate attention. My aunt and uncle filled the space between stories with soft laughter and knowing looks. Everyone seemed comfortable, settled into their place. I listened, nodding when it felt appropriate, smiling when the tone invited it. When I spoke, it was brief and careful, shaped to match the mood rather than redirect it. I had learned that this approach kept things light and avoided unnecessary pauses. The story that led to the laughter had been simple. A memory from years ago, told casually as if it held no weight. In their version, I was quiet and hesitant, someone who needed guidance, someone whose uncertainty made the moment entertaining. The way they told it framed my stillness as something endearing, almost charming. I remembered that day differently. I had been quiet, yes, but not unsure. I had been observing, waiting, choosing my words carefully. That part never seemed to make it into the retelling. As the laughter faded, conversation moved on quickly, eager to fill the space. I stayed silent, my hands resting flat on the table now, grounding myself in the cool surface beneath my palms. I noticed how easily the moment passed without anyone checking my expression or meeting my eyes. This was not new. It was a pattern so familiar that it usually passed without notice. Still, something about the ease of that laughter stayed with me, heavier than it should have been. I looked around the table, taking in each face with a clarity I had not allowed myself before. These were people who cared for me in the ways they understood. None of them meant harm, yet the space I occupied among them had been defined without my input, reinforced quietly over time. The conversation shifted toward plans for the coming weeks. Dates were mentioned, preferences discussed, assumptions made about who could adjust and who could not. I noticed, as I often did, that my name was absent from the considerations. It was assumed I would adapt, as I always had. I told myself, briefly, that it did not matter. That thought surfaced out of habit, not conviction. I felt it settle, then loosen, as I allowed myself to question it. The laughter from earlier echoed faintly in my mind. Not as sound but as understanding. It was not the humor that unsettled me. It was what it revealed about how easily my role had been accepted as fixed. I reached for my glass and took a measured sip of water, giving myself time to breathe evenly. No one noticed the pause. No one needed to. The room moved forward without interruption. For years, I had believed that staying calm and agreeable was a strength that kept everything intact. I had thought that silence protected me from being misunderstood. In that moment, I saw how it had also made it easy for others to define me without resistance. The realization did not arrive dramatically. It settled slowly, steady and unavoidable. I understood that if I continued to occupy this space without adjustment, nothing would change, not because they refused to see me, but because I had made it unnecessary for them to try. I did not speak then. I did not interrupt the conversation or correct the story. I stayed exactly where I was, outwardly unchanged, listening with the same attentive posture I had perfected over time. Inside, though something shifted, it was quiet and contained, but it was firm. I recognized that my calm had been mistaken for consent, and that distinction mattered more than I had ever admitted. As the meal continued, I became aware of how often I anticipated needs before they were voiced. I passed dishes, refilled glasses, and adjusted my chair to make room without thinking. These actions had always made me useful, welcome without being central. That usefulness now felt different. It felt conditional, tied to how little space I required. When someone asked a question and answered it themselves before I could respond, I noticed it clearly. When my comment was acknowledged with a nod and then set aside, I registered it without shrinking away. I was no longer numbing myself to these moments. The evening unfolded predictably after that. Conversations softened, voices lowered, and people began to relax into the comfort of familiarity. I remained engaged, present, and composed. I realized then that understanding does not always demand immediate action. Sometimes it simply requires honesty with oneself. I stayed calm through the rest of the night. Not because I felt invisible, but because I was paying attention in a way I never had before. I was no longer measuring my worth by how smoothly the evening passed. When the plates were cleared and people began to stand, I felt grounded rather than drained. I had not said anything differently, but I was no longer participating blindly. As I prepared to leave, I knew this gathering would not be the one where everything changed. That was not how shifts like this worked. What mattered was that I had seen my role clearly for the first time. The laughter had not hurt me. It had informed me, and once something is understood with that level of clarity, it cannot be unseen. The next time we gathered, the house felt louder than I remembered, even before everyone arrived. Doors opened and closed in quick succession, voices carrying down the hallway as coats were placed on familiar hooks. I stood near the counter for a moment, listening to the rhythm of arrival, noticing how easily the space filled without anyone needing direction. I set out napkins carefully, aligning them with the edges of the table. This had always been my quiet contribution, something useful that required no acknowledgement. As I worked, I noticed how natural it felt to anticipate what was needed before anyone asked, as if my presence was meant to smooth over details rather than take up space. When everyone finally settled, the conversation moved quickly, skipping over small talk and landing immediately on stories already half told. I took my seat, the same one I usually chose, close enough to listen but far enough from the center that no one would expect me to guide the discussion. My brother began talking about a recent decision he had made, his voice confident and steady. The room responded immediately, questions following one another without pause. My parents leaned in, engaged and curious, their attention focused fully on him. I listened, tracking the details, noticing how easily space was made for his thoughts. When I opened my mouth to add something small, the moment passed before the words reached my tongue. Someone else filled the gap without noticing it had existed. I closed my mouth gently and nodded instead, reminding myself that this was how things usually went. Still, I felt the difference now. What once felt neutral now felt like a pattern I could see clearly. As the conversation shifted, my aunt mentioned plans for an upcoming weekend. Dates were exchanged quickly, assumptions layered into the discussion without hesitation. I noticed how my schedule was treated as flexible by default, not because I had said so, but because I always had been. No one asked if I was available. No one paused to check. The plan moved forward easily, shaped around the loudest voices at the table. I watched the process unfold with quiet attention. This was not new information, but it was newly understood. I could see how often my silence had been interpreted as agreement, how my willingness to adapt had become an expectation rather than a choice. Someone made a light remark about how I was always easygoing, always willing to adjust. The tone was friendly, almost complimentary. A few people smiled, clearly meaning no harm. I returned the smile automatically, though this time it felt measured rather than instinctive. The comment lingered with me longer than it used to. I thought about how often I had reinforced this version of myself. How many times I had stepped aside because it felt easier than explaining my needs. How often I had decided that speaking up would complicate things unnecessarily. The room buzzed with overlapping voices, comfortable and familiar. I felt present within it, but also slightly removed, as if I were watching the scene rather than fully immersed in it. Later, as dishes were cleared, I found myself standing beside my mother in the kitchen. We moved in practiced silence, rinsing and stacking without discussion. The routine felt comforting, but also revealing. "You don't have to help every time," she said lightly, her eyes still on the sink. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. The exchange ended there, as it always did. No follow-up, no deeper question. I realized how often our conversations ended at the surface, efficient but incomplete. From the living room, laughter rose again, softer this time, attached to another story. I dried my hands slowly, listening without needing to hear every word. When I returned, the seating had shifted slightly. I took the remaining spot without comment. No one adjusted to make room for me, and no one needed to. I fit where there was space. The story being told was harmless, familiar. Still, I noticed how I was referenced briefly, almost as an aside. My role summarized quickly before the focus moved on. I did not correct it. I simply noted how easily it happened. For the first time, I did not feel the urge to make myself smaller in response. I stayed upright, my posture relaxed, my attention steady. As the evening wound down, people began checking their phones, conversations thinning into smaller groups. I spoke when spoken to, answered clearly, and did not rush to fill silence where it appeared. When it was time to leave, I hugged everyone in the usual order. The exchanges were warm, familiar, and uncomplicated. Nothing about the night seemed remarkable on the surface. Driving home, I felt the difference settle in quietly. I was not replaying conversations or wishing I had said something different. I was simply aware. I understood that noticing patterns did not obligate me to disrupt them immediately. Awareness alone was a form of movement, even if it did not look like action yet. The laughter from the previous gathering returned to my mind briefly. Not with discomfort, but with clarity. It had marked the moment I stopped confusing calm with contentment. I realized that my role had not changed overnight. What had changed was my relationship to it. That understanding stayed with me, steady and patient, as I prepared for whatever moment would come next. The gathering that followed was meant to be simple, something routine that required no preparation beyond showing up. It was a Sunday afternoon, quiet by design, the kind of day my family liked to keep predictable. One arrived a few minutes after the agreed time, carrying nothing but my keys and the familiar expectation that I would blend in without effort. I paused just inside the doorway, listening to voices carry from the back of the house. The sound was relaxed, unguarded, and confident. It reminded me how easily conversation flowed when no one felt the need to make room for me within it. I set my bag down and joined everyone in the living room. Taking a seat at the edge of the couch, the cushions dipped slightly beneath me, and I adjusted without drawing attention. Someone acknowledged my arrival with a brief smile before returning to the discussion. Already in progress. They were talking about a family decision that had been made recently, one that affected everyone in small ways. The details were being shared as if they were already settled, as if the outcome had been obvious from the start. I listened closely, recognizing the shape of the conversation. Opinions were offered confidently, reinforced quickly, and accepted without resistance. The tone was light, even amused at times. When my name came up, it was attached to an assumption. Someone joked about how I would manage icily, how I always did. The comment was followed by laughter, not sharp or cruel, but certain. The sound landed differently this time. It was not the laughter itself that stayed with me, but what it revealed. The comfort with which my flexibility was treated as a given. The ease with which my perspective was summarized without being asked for. I felt my body respond before my thoughts caught up. My shoulders remained relaxed, but something steadied within me. I did not feel embarrassed or defensive. I felt clear. That was when I understood everything. I understood that my calm had been interpreted as consent, that my silence had been taken as reassurance, that my willingness to adapt had slowly rewritten my role without my awareness. The laughter faded naturally as the conversation moved on, but the moment did not pass for me. It settled quietly, without urgency, and reshaped how I saw myself within the room. I did not interrupt. I did not correct anyone. I did not explain. I stayed present, listening with intention instead of habit. As the discussion continued, I noticed how often decisions were framed as collective while being shaped by only a few voices. I noticed how my reactions were watched for confirmation, not contribution. At one point, someone asked if I was okay with the plan, already smiling as if the answer was known. "I'll need to think about it," I said calmly. The room adjusted around my words. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Someone nodded. Someone else shrugged. The conversation moved forward with slightly less certainty than before. No one challenged me. No one pushed back. I felt no rush of adrenaline, no sense of risk. The statement had not been a confrontation. It had been a boundary spoken at its smallest point. Later, I found myself alone in the kitchen, rinsing a glass that did not need washing. The water ran steadily, grounding me in the moment. I said my name quietly to myself. Lena, as if reaffirming something I had misplaced and just recovered. The sound of it felt familiar in a way that mattered. I thought about how often I had introduced myself through behavior rather than words. How my role had been defined by what I allowed rather than what I chose. When I returned to the living room, the conversation had shifted again. People were relaxed, unaware that anything significant had occurred. In a way, they were right. The shift had not been external. It had happened entirely within me. As the afternoon came to a close, I gathered my things without rushing. I said goodbye with the same warmth I always had, but without the quiet fatigue that usually followed. Driving home, I did not replay the laughter or the comment attached to it. I replayed my own response instead. Not the words themselves, but how they felt. They felt honest. They felt sufficient. I understood then that clarity did not need an audience to be real. It only needed space to exist. That space was something I had finally allowed myself to take. The weeks that followed unfolded without any visible disruption. No one called to ask what I had meant. No one circled back to the comment or the laughter that had clarified everything for me. Life continued along its familiar lines, steady and predictable on the surface. What changed was how I entered those spaces. The next time my family gathered, it was for a small celebration, something informal that did not require planning beyond deciding what to bring. I arrived on time, neither early nor late, and stepped inside with a sense of calm that felt earned rather than practiced. I noticed how quickly conversations formed. How easily roles reappeared. I took my place among them, not at the edge this time, but not at the center either. I sat where I wanted to sit, without adjusting myself to fit an unspoken expectation. Someone asked me a question midway through the evening, casual and open-ended. I answered honestly, without editing my response for ease. The words landed without friction. No one laughed. No one rushed past what I said. I felt no need to fill the silence that followed. It was not uncomfortable. It was simply space. As the night continued, decisions were discussed the way they always had been. Suggestions were offered. Assumptions surfaced. When my input was invited, I shared it clearly. When it was not, I did not rush to supply it. I paid attention to how my body felt in those moments. There was no tension in my shoulders. No quiet pressure to smooth things over. I was not waiting to be overlooked, because I was no longer defining myself by whether or not I was included. At one point, I stepped outside onto the back porch alone. The air was cool, carrying the distant sound of voices behind me. The light from the kitchen window spilled across the wooden steps, steady and warm. I stood there for a moment, breathing slowly, aware of how different this felt from other evenings like it. I was not escaping. I was choosing. Inside, the laughter rose again, softer this time, less pointed. It did not reach me the same way. It no longer explained anything about my place there. When I returned, no one commented on my absence. No one needed to. I slipped back into the room without ceremony, present on my own terms. Later, as people began to leave, my mother hugged me a little longer than usual. She did not say anything, but her hand rested against my back with a weight that felt thoughtful. I did not read into it. I did not need to. Driving home, the road stretched ahead of me, quiet and familiar. I thought about how long it had taken me to understand what that laughter had revealed. Not about them, but about me. I had mistaken patience for obligation. I had confused calm with agreement. I had allowed my role to be shaped by what I tolerated rather than what I chose. That understanding did not make me angry. It made me precise. I knew now that I could remain calm without remaining small. That I could love my family without disappearing inside their expectations. That silence, when chosen deliberately, could be a form of self-respect rather than surrender. At home, I set my keys down and turned on a single lamp. The room filled with soft light. I sat for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. Nothing dramatic had changed. No lines had been drawn. No declarations had been made, and yet, everything was different. I had understood something essential, and that understanding stayed with me, steady and intact, long after the laughter faded into memory.